Hey guys, today on the podcast we are going to be talking about a book from a listener, a haunted house, and of course the weekly reveal to what magical book I have pulled down from my to-be-read shelf. All of that and more this week on A Novel Review. Hello and welcome to the Literature Podcast, A Novel Review. My name is Seamus, your host, and together we will discuss, dissect, and explore the wonderful world of literature. And the wonderful world of literature is a vast and dense jungle. So let's start making our way through, one book at a time. Hey guys, welcome back. My name's Seamus, I'm the host. This is A Novel Review, a book podcast. And today we are exploring, we are discussing, we are looking at The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson. And this is a fantastic book. But before we get into that, we always take a moment to reflect on any mantelpiece moments. Something to highlight from the week past. And this last week, I received this book, Love Love TV, from a listener, Gabriel Ruesso. He sent it to me. He said, can you just check it out? No pressure to put it on the podcast or anything like that. And I said, no, of course we can, we can at least feature it on the podcast. And it looks really interesting, actually. I think it's his debut novel. Printed out really well, but it seems to be about, well, from what I've read of the blurb, it seems to be about a kind of TV show, a reality TV show on a remote island that sort of turns into this kind of vibe of Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, or if anyone had to read The Most Dangerous Game for high school, I did. Seems to be this kind of, or even like Squid Game maybe, something like that. Like, it seems to be this reality TV show where bad things start to happen, and it's made out that it's kind of encouraged by the producers, but it seems to be this exploration of what people will do to win and all the evil and wicked things people are prepared to do to win. And it sounds like it gets quite hostile, and there might even be a few deaths. So yeah, that's why I kind of say like Squid Game mixed with And Then There Were None, Most Dangerous Game kind of vibe. So that sounds really good. I'm pretty keen to start that. Probably start reading it maybe this weekend even, because I got a bit of time and I'm between books at the moment. So that's very good. Gabriel Ruesso, Love Love TV. Check it out if you're interested, if that sounds interesting. Yeah, thank you for that. Housekeeping, as always, if you would like to like and subscribe, that would be amazing. That would be incredible. 5-star reviews, also amazing and incredible. So thank you so much for that. Please, thank you. Cheers. Okay, let's get into it now. Shirley Jackson and The Haunting of Hill House. A near perfect horror story, it says here on the front cover, quoted by Stephen King, and I have to agree, it is pretty much perfect in terms of horror stories. Although I haven't read too much horror stories, so I'm not exactly like a, aficionado on those kind of things, but it was damn near perfect. This was the first Shirley Jackson I ever read. I first read it in 2021 maybe. And yeah, first Shirley Jackson I ever read, completely made me fall in love with her as a writer. Her other books, novels, novellas, short stories, just incredible. And this was my first time, I guess, rereading a Shirley Jackson. So first book I've read from her, and the first time I've reread something from her, and it was just as incredible. It definitely holds up on a second read. If anything, it was better on the second read because you get to see things more clearly now that you might not have noticed the first time. And I think, actually, I'm going to launch straight into an overview first before I get too much into the discussion of it. It's basically about this guy, Dr. Montague, who hires a haunted house. And I say that in inverted commas because we're not sure if it's a haunted house, but he is this, I think it's for his PhD. He's trying to explore sort of these mediums and supernatural occurrences. And so he rents this haunted house and invites 3 people along who are historically predisposed to things like this, the supernatural occurrences. And basically, he just wants to run a live experiment of living in this house and seeing what happens, seeing if they experience anything, documenting, of course, what experiences. And the whole book is told through the narrator, Eleanor, and you sort of follow her on her experiences in the house. Very well written. That is a pretty brief overview, which is the intention of them. And I think now, I can finally get into the discussion of the book. I will caveat that by saying there are going to be some pretty intense spoilers of this book, so tune out now. I don't think you can really discuss this book without spoiling it, or I wouldn't want to discuss this book without spoiling it. So apologies, but keep listening to hear some spoilers. So I think a really great place to start with this book is genuinely at the beginning when exploring it. And I don't mean sort of on the first page, I mean the title itself, The Haunting of Hill House. I think if you read that, I'm going to say quite naturally, you read The Haunting of Hill House with Hill House being the subject of the sentence, which means, it's a haunted house. It's a haunted house, and it's the haunting of Hill House. And that's kind of how you read the sentence quite naturally and how you perceive the story unfolding. However, in this story, there is elements. There are moments, there are misdirections where you don't know what's going on in this story. You don't know if this house is really haunted. And I think the wonderful thing about this book is Shirley Jackson never really reveals one way or the other, but she does give enough evidence for one way or the other. And I guess the title is the perfect example of this, because as I've just said, if you read it as the Hill House being the subject of the sentence, it reads as a haunted house. However, English is a funny language, and of being where it is, the haunting of Hill House, means that we can read Hill House as the object of the sentence, the haunting of Hill House, which implies that Hill House is this regular house that is being haunted by whoever comes to it. It's this poor, innocent house that has been labelled haunted, and now people come and haunt Hill House, the haunting of Hill House. I do tend to fall one way rather than the other in terms of, is this an actual haunted house, or is Eleanor doing the haunting in this story? And I think the next great place to start is the opening paragraph of the book, which I will now read for you. No live organism can continue for long to exist sanely under conditions of absolute reality. Even larks and katydids are supposed by some to dream. Hill House, not sane, stood by itself against its hills, holding darkness within. It had stood so for 80 years and might stand for 80 more. Within, walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. Shirley Jackson has this wonderful skill of just setting the tone for a story from the opening paragraph. She does the exact same in We've Always Lived in the Castle. How does that, the final line of that first paragraph is, and everyone in my family was dead, or something like that. And it's just, it really just sets the tone for the story, and it's completely the same here. Whatever walked there, walked alone. Now, I think coming into this story, you kind of read that and you're like, okay, this is a bit austere, this is a bit weird, wacky, wonderful, this is meant to be a horror story. It sounds interesting, let's read on. But I really like that last line, whatever walked there, walked alone, because it implies that whatever you're bringing to like if you go to this house, if Eleanor, for instance, goes to this house, you are walking alone there, which kind of teeters on the brink of what I believe the story to be, is that it's all kind of the delusions of Eleanor, and this house is actually just a pretty normal house, and she's actually doing the haunting. But then what I find really interesting, because you could easily skip over that first paragraph as, just a first paragraph, but the final lines of the book, and this is why I said there are going to be spoilers, because I'm literally going to read the final few lines. And I mean, it's kind of funny because I'm saying there's going to be spoilers and I'm reading the final few lines of the book, but I guess you don't get that experience of it, but you have already read these lines before, because it says, within, its walls continued upright, bricks met neatly, floors were firm and doors were sensibly shut. Silence lay steadily against the wood and stone of Hill House, and whatever walked there, walked alone. So it's actually repeating the words I just read on the first page of the story, and also on the last page of the story. And I think that's really interesting to repeat them, but also have the words being whatever walked there, walked alone. Because throughout this story, there is plenty of evidence that these are just the delusions of Eleanor, and that she is perhaps doing the haunting, which is, the way I fall. And I guess something I noticed on my second read is just how, I guess, it's difficult, because I'm going to repeat it again, aren't I? That there's enough evidence one way or the other, but getting it now, this second read, you can have a bit more closer attention to what is actually being done here. And like, for the instance, one of the characters is being introduced. Her name is Fyodor, but she's introduced in such a way that there is just this element of doubt in your mind as the reader. I'll read you this paragraph because it's just a random paragraph. Eleanor's in this house alone besides the housekeeper. and she's just kind of going about her business. And then all of a sudden she just starts talking, and you don't know even if it's her talking. You don't know who she's talking to. You don't even know if it's Eleanor. And so it literally just starts. It says, "Thank heavens you're here," she said, peering through the dimness. "Thank heavens somebody's here." She realized without surprise that she was speaking as though Mrs. Dudley, the housekeeper, could not hear her, although Mrs. Dudley stood straight and pale in the hall. "Come on up," Eleanor said. "You have to carry your own suitcase." She was breathless and seemed unable to stop talking, her usual shyness melted away by relief. "My name's Eleanor Vance," she said, "and I'm so glad you're here." And it's such an interesting way to introduce another character, because you don't know Eleanor's talking until it comes up later in the paragraph, and you don't know who she's talking to, and so it creates this very subtle illusion that she could be talking, well, technically from our point of view, she's talking to no one, because we don't know who she's talking to, and so it creates this very subtle illusion that there's no one actually there that she's talking to. And it's these little moments that are threaded throughout the story that really kind of, I guess, sow that element of doubt in your mind as to whether there are actually people in this house, or whether Eleanor is just having this kind of experience that is just completely haunting. So that's just, one of those elements that I absolutely love. And it's something that I think really rewards rereads, because you don't really, I didn't really pick up on it the first time I read it, but this whole story is just masterfully put together. Something else I found I loved, and coming to this story again for a second time, is the opening to the book. And I'm going to go back, a bit now that I've been speaking about the actual story, but the opening to the story, because it's really unsettling, and I think it's masterfully laid out by Shirley Jackson. It's a very similar opening to Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho, if anyone's seen that film. In that film, I can't remember her name, but she steals a bit of money from work. It's a bit more than a bit, but it's a fair chunk of money from work, and she's basically running away from home. And then this police officer notices she's acting a bit weird, and so the police officer starts following her. He's not following her for any particular reason other than she's acting suspect. He doesn't know anything, but when you're watching it, you've got this really kind of eerie feeling that something's going to go wrong. It's really, tension building. And it's the same in this story, in that Eleanor has received this letter from Dr. Montague. He said, "Come to this house. We're going to try this experiment. Have this experience. When you're driving, don't stop in the town, because the townsfolk are all really, really weird, and they don't like Hill House. They think it's, haunted technically, and they're really standoffish, and they're really rude, and they're the weird ones pretty much. We're the normal ones going to try experience this haunted house, but these regular people of this town are really weird." Eleanor is not the best at following rules, and so she naturally stops in the town. And it's just because you have that moment, those words, those few words, one line from Dr. Montague saying that these townsfolk are really not the most accepting people, and they're really quite rude to outsiders. You start reading them in that tone. You start experiencing what they're saying through that lens. And so Eleanor's having this coffee, and she's talking to this barista, and you're trying to read at this scene and figure out what's weird about it, because something just seems off, and there seems to be this really strong tension through the book. And there's this third character in the cafe as well, and he seems to be watching them with hawk eyes speak, and then all of a sudden he just stands up and leaves. And you're like, oh, this is really weird behavior. What's going on? And I remember reading it for the first time thinking, something's going to happen. And I guess that's sort of the nature of horror stories, is they put you on edge, and you're kind of overanalyzing it in a sense, because you're expecting the ball to drop at some point, and you don't know when or where it's going to be. So you're always on edge. And then reading it a second time, I was like, this actually isn't that weird a scene. She's in a cafe. This is before phones and headphones and social media and anything. So the fact that she's talking to the barista is relatively normal. The fact that this third person's listening onto the conversation, I guess, is also relatively normal, because if you're in an isolated environment and two people are talking and you're sitting there, you're probably naturally going to watch the conversation and listen into the conversation. He gets up and leaves. We never see him again. And then you kind of realize this barista isn't weird. She's just like 20 years old and probably doesn't really care about her job. She's probably a bit annoyed that she lives in a quiet little town and wants, a bit more adventure. And it's actually this really normal scene. But because we've got those words from Dr. Montague that Shirley Jackson has masterfully set up, we're reading it through a completely different lens of what's going on here. What's weird about this scene? I'm on edge. This is anxiety inducing, and what's happening. And I just love the fact that this is a horror story that's taking place in Hill House, and it's all about, is Hill House haunted? But she's still got that masterful skill of setting the story up from the beginning. This is a horror story throughout. This isn't a horror story where we've got a really nice opening section and then all of a sudden the ball drops and we are in a haunted house. The doors are locked and we're stuck inside. No, this is anxiety inducing from the opening paragraph, essentially. One of the wonderful things about Shirley Jackson is she has this really distinct writing style and this really distinct narrative voice, and it's really prevalent throughout this story. And I've got a paragraph here that I'm going to read because I just think it's a really curious way to talk and discuss about characters and explore different things in characters, and it's a really interesting way to phrase them. And again, I think it just builds that little bit of tension. It's a bit it doesn't seem like a normal way to address yourself and talk to yourself and interact with yourself as is going on in this scene. So it kind of unsettles you as the reader. So I'll just read the paragraph and stop talking. Eleanor found herself unexpectedly admiring her own feet. Theodora dreamed over the fire just beyond the tips of her toes, and Eleanor thought with deep satisfaction that her feet were handsome in their red sandals. What a complete and separate thing I am, she thought, going from my red toes to the top of my head, individually and I, possessed of attributes belonging only to me. I have red shoes, she thought, that go with being Eleanor. I dislike lobster and sleep on my left side and crack my knuckles when I am nervous and save buttons. I am holding a brandy glass which is mine because I am here, and I am using it and I have a place in this room. I have red shoes and tomorrow I will wake up and I will still be here. And it's this really kind of curious, and it happens multiple times throughout this book, and it also, I remember it happens in We Have Always Lived in This Castle. We Have Always Lived in the Castle. It's this kind of listicle, I have red shoes, I dislike lobster, I sleep on my left side, I crack my knuckles when I am nervous and save buttons, I'm holding my brandy glass which is mine because I'm here, I'm using it, and I have a place in this room, and I have red shoes. And it's this kind of repetitive sentence structure that kind of unnerves you as a reader, because you're like, is this stuff I'm meant to be paying attention to? Is this important to the story, or is this just kind of like a bit of a weird and wacky, wonderful character telling me information, or am I just experiencing her thoughts in a way that's giving me information that's really unessential to the story, but also kind of essential to the story because it gives you that subtle insight into the mentality of the character itself. And it's just one of the reasons I absolutely loved this book. And so the story progresses in this really kind of, I'm going to say, quite a structured way, in that, things start to happen in the house. And what's interesting, I think, is things always seem to happen, or they always seem to be directed towards Eleanor herself, which again is, I think, just the writing of Shirley Jackson kind of laying that doubt in your mind as to whether this is all in Eleanor's head, or if this is a real experience with multiple people in the experience as well. But I think one of the most incredible things of this book, and again, the reread was just incredible for this because you really get to see it, is the fear that builds throughout the story. And I guess the fear that builds not only for the house itself, because Eleanor actually seems, she's frightened by the house, but she seems to be more frightened, and the fear seems to more come from the social isolation that she experiences in the house, and sort of navigating that sort of dilemma as relationships start to form between these characters after spending such a concentrated and acute period of time together in a haunted house. You've naturally got to bond quite quickly and become friendly quite quickly, not necessarily in a romantic way, but when it's four people experiencing a haunted house, you generally want to not be fighting with people in the house because you want to feel happy and safe in their kind of presence. And it's watching her sort of mentally deteriorate as these little pockets of relationships start to form. And I think that's what I really loved about this story, is you just get to see it's very much, it feels like a ghost story. It feels like a horror story, but it also feels like a social isolation story, and just how Eleanor sort of conducts herself through these moments and through these relationships. And she seems to be this really lonely character, but I never really felt sad for her in a sense, because she always seemed to just be stepping that little bit beyond what I thought was, I guess, socially acceptable. There's one scene where she kind of says to Theodora that she's just going to come home with Theodora. She's like, oh, I've got nothing to go home to, so I'll just come with you. And Theodora's like, yeah, we've known each other like 3 days. Let's put this in perspective. but I really loved having that mental exploration of not just seeing people be haunted or haunt this house, but also getting the insight of their own mental exploration in this house and how those relationships develop. And I think, Shirley Jackson is just so good. I I really can't recommend it enough. So yeah, a near perfect horror story. If you're looking for something really ambiguous, I mean, as I pointed out, it's ambiguous literally from the title to the end, to the final words of the book. It is an incredible story, and I think you could read it many times and have different opinions as to whether you think the house is doing the haunting or the house is being haunted itself. Shirley Jackson is just an absolute master. I have read it twice. I am going to rate this a 4.8 out of 5. Okay, so what was I reading this week? This week I started reading White Nights by Dostoevsky. This kind of popped up a few times on various social medias and people spoke really highly of it. I think Dostoevsky is one of those writers where people will always speak quite highly of everything he's written because I'm about halfway through it, White Nights, and it's about 60 pages long and I am not really getting the hype. I mean, it's still a good story by its own regard, but I'm not sort of getting the hype, and I don't see how the next 30 pages are going to sway me to go, this was an incredible short story, if you know what I mean. Definitely a solid showing from Dostoevsky. Definitely elements that, I mean, the masterful nature of Dostoevsky is he kind of can just, perform vivisection on you as a person and peer into your soul. And there's still definitely elements of that, but in terms of some of the other writings, I don't think this is going to be my favorite, but I'm still going to see it through to the end. I'm going to go back and find these various comments on White Nights and see what people were actually saying about it, because yeah, I'm not really getting it at the moment in terms of it being a, absolutely fantastic piece of literature. So I'll go back, I'll finish the story first, I'll go back, have a read, see what people are actually saying. Maybe I missed something, maybe it's just not my cup of tea. Who knows? If you have listened this far, please consider hitting those 5 stars. Also, you can head along to the website and support the podcast in other ways. But as always, thank you for your attention. So I think it's time to end this episode. And today, this lovely and quite sad little paragraph from Leaf by Niggle by Tolkien, which I read last week. And yeah, this was just quite a poignant, but also quite a sad thought and paragraph from the story towards the very end of it. So spoilers if you want to read it. That was probably the last time Niggle's name ever came up in conversation. However, Aitken's preserved the odd corner. Most of it crumbled, but one beautiful leaf remained intact. Aitken's had it framed. Later he left it to the town museum, and for a long time while, Leaf by Niggle hung there in a recess, and was noticed by a few eyes. But eventually the museum was burned down, and the Leaf and Niggle were entirely forgotten in his old country.